next presenter is going to be Phillip Cunio. He is a corporate lecturer at ExoAnalytic Solutions, and he will be presenting tonight on Salamis, Seaborne and Spaceborne battles. Phillip Cunio is the corporate lecturer and chief systems engineer across a broad portfolio of space situational awareness projects at ExoAnalytic Solutions. He develops novel techniques to extract actionable information from the large volumes of data collected by ExoAnalytic's Global Telescope Network, and he occasionally designs and builds prototypes for small mobile sensors. He studied aeronautics and astronautics at MIT, and while there, he developed a hopping vehicle for planetary surface exploration. I wonder if it had incentives to hop higher or something like that after Chris's presentation. He later moved to work for Air Force Research Labs at Kirtland Air Force Base, designing imaging systems for major space experiments. He's authored or co-authored technical publications in areas ranging from human factors to runway acoustic mapping. And he's got a long background in educational and public outreach, including consulting as a technical expert for works in the theater and film. All right, Phil, you are up. Take it away.
Oh, thank you very much, Ian. I'm very happy to be here. All right, let me pull my slides up. All right, hopefully you're seeing those. All right, so I am here to talk about Salamis, the Seaborne battle, and what that might look like in space, just as a way of thinking about things that have already happened so we can get a lens on what might happen. Actually, in this case, hopefully not happen. So I think most people are aware that the Greeks, the ancient city-states of Greece, were one of the sides of the battle, and they were part of it, in part because they were interested in democracy. They had invented it for themselves and were of the opinion that it was a pretty good thing to have, not only for themselves, but also for other city-states that had originally been founded by Greeks that were on the other side of the Aegean Sea. Now, if you know that the Aegean Sea sits between Greece and Asia, you know that on the other side of the Aegean Sea, in the region called Lydia, where the other Greek cities were, there's also the border of the Persian Empire. And the Greeks in Greece were sort of really inclined to encourage their friends in Lydia to not always go along with the program. And the emperor of Persia, Xerxes, was not necessarily very enamored of that, so his reaction was to try and stop it, and unfortunately, that wasn't quite the way that things were going to play out. So, at some point in fact, 480 BC, the Persian emperor took his army and his navy, and he marched all the way over to Greece, and he started making things happen the way he wanted to make them happen. He took over. He actually was able to take the city of Athens and wreck the temple atop their hill. So he essentially kicked all the Athenians out of Athens. He was already in the process of winning, and they had to retreat across a little strait to another island called Salamis. Their whole entire population went. And this essentially was the stage being set for their battle. So the Athenian side, the Greek side, is set up on their island. And it's composed of not just Athens, but other Greek city-states. So here's the rundown of the two sides in a little bit more detail. On one side is the side we can call the Allies. They essentially call themselves that. And the other side is, of course, the Empire. The Empire is much larger, much more powerful, has a much larger army, has a much larger navy. And the Empire's goal is to take over Greece, destroy the influence of Athens and Sparta and their other city-states that follow them. And the Greek city-states' goal is, well, it varies. Generally, not that is the goal, but some of the city-states are not necessarily so inclined to go along with it. So right now, things are not looking particularly great for the Allied side. Their leader has been kicked out of its home, and they're all stuck on an island somewhere while the Imperial Army and Navy stare them down. Okay, so obviously there was a battle. This is a much later painting, but if you look at this painting of the Battle of Salamis, you'll note that there's what looks a lot like the Greek deities actually intervening. And this reflects some of the actual things that the Greeks seem to have thought occurred there. They thought the battle was so significant that it must have been taking place with some divine intervention or some higher power intervention of some kind. So this was a pretty big deal, and the people who were there were aware of it. Everyone knew it was going to be a big deal before it was happening, too. Well, If you don't know, I'll go through what exactly happened. Well, it was the Imperial Fleet that was destroyed. Okay, the larger fleet somehow ended up not winning that. And in fact, it was the Persian emperor and most of his army who ended up being compelled to retreat. And it was a decisive Greek victory. Well, that's sure unexpected. In fact, that's not quite the only thing. That was a fairly, I think, common reaction. Herodotus, who's regarded today as the first person to write history, his reaction was essentially, well, that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. I want to know why. And he went around and worked on his book, history, to go and figure out why. So what happened and why was is a question that's been on people's minds since shortly after it actually happened. I'll give you a little breakdown. So this is a small map. The Allies, especially the Athenians, are all on that beach at the left called Salamis. They're in the town of Salamis. The Imperial Fleet is coming out of Piraeus. So I actually tried to sketch triremes roughly to scale. This is what about 380 of them would look like crammed into that strait there where they came out of on the morning of September 25th, 480 BC. So about almost 2501 years ago. And here is the Imperial Fleet. And notice they didn't actually all go into one big body. They split up to try and meet some other. They split up because they were expecting the Greek fleet to split up. The Greek fleet did not. So the Allied fleet and the Imperial fleet met in that pretty narrow strait. And it was a strategic and tactical victory for the Allies. They lost about 40 triremes, and in the end, about half of the Imperial Navy either was sunk or completely fled, and the entire Imperial fleet was basically disassembled as a result of this one day's worth of combat. Again, the question I think on that most people would ask is, how exactly? I think the answer is mistakes were made. There's a lot of schools of thought and a lot of rabbit holes to go down onto exactly why, but I think people say the Greek triremes were heavier, there was better wind, they knew what they were doing. I think the real answer would essentially be the Allied admiral picked the battleground and conditions. Themistocles, the admiral, basically said, this is the time I want to go and fight. This is when we'll have our best advantage. This is what we're going to do. And the Imperial fleet played right into his hands, and his chances for victory were greater, and they ended up winning. Why did the Empire let that happen? Talk about three things I think are factors: strategic imperatives, counterintelligence, and logistics. Okay. On the Imperial side, the strategic imperatives are that you need naval support, you need the presence of the Emperor. You only have so much attention you can offer to things. You need naval support because it's a long way on land, but it's a much shorter way over sea. And if you also look closely, you'll notice that one of the most powerful Greek cities, Athens, backs right onto the water. And Sparta, while it's landlocked, isn't exactly able to do a lot of moving around without coming pretty close to the ocean before you get somewhere interesting. So if you have naval superiority, you have a major edge if you're fighting in Greece. You need naval support for your land army. I'll also note that the emperor had to be there because it was essentially part of his job to show up and do things like put down rebellions. And if he was in one place doing it, he couldn't be in other places. So he couldn't stay in one place doing that very long. On the counter-intel side, well, the Imperial side knew that they could get over this easily just by paying people to come away from the Allies and join them. And of course, the Greek admiral said, well, gee, that sounds great. I'll certainly be sure to do exactly that. And of course he didn't. I think it's worth noting that the Allies might have been better at this because there were so many different city-states together, notionally as the Allies, who were always arguing with each other. They essentially practiced this all the time. On the logistics side, I'll just note that the logistics for the Imperial side were very impressive. In fact, there's one place where they didn't want to sail around a mountain, so they dug a canal. You can still see traces of the canal today. They're very slow, though. The build-up to this battle from the Imperial side was at least a 5-year effort and probably something closer to 10. On the Allied side, well, the Athenian fleet was the core of the Allied fleet, and 3 years prior, it had not really existed. It was the result of a peace dividend. So the logistics for the Allies are much more agile and flexible. Even if they're better for the Empire, they're much slower. Okay, so we already said we think the stronger force got maneuvered into an engagement on a ground chosen by the weaker force. And in space, what might that look like? Well, talk about our three factors. And I'm going to talk about two sides here. I'm going to call them blue and red. In this case, blue is actually going to play the role of the empire. They're bigger. They have a much bigger investment. They cover more ground. They want to do more things. Red is the other side. In space, I think it's accurate to say the blue side would have to split its attention. You'd have multiple competing timelines. You'd have no elite goals. If you have a much bigger investment in infrastructure in space, you want to keep it that way, and you want to make sure your victory is complete and overwhelming. It's the equivalent of wanting to just completely wreck Greece, the power of Athens and Sparta. You want to have full control over space. No half measures. On the counterintelligence side, well, I think that one might be, again, a bit of a wash. If you're the blue, more powerful side, the equivalent to what the Persian Empire did would be to publish what you can do and hope it intimidates people. And on both sides, you would essentially have knowledge or examples of the other side acting. So I don't know that it could necessarily be clear who has the edge, but there might be some deeper rabbit holes to go down here. Without going too far down those, I'll just note that there'd be other factors that played a bigger role, including logistics. Once again, you would see that the blue lines for a much bigger, more far-flung side will be much longer. Red supply lines, red logistics will be much shorter. They'll have much more agility and turnaround time. I think what that points to, if you're making an analogy here, is that a short, energetic engagement is going to favor the red side. A long, incremental campaign will favor the blue side, most likely. So let's come up with a little scenario. Blue has a lot of infrastructure on orbit. Red likes to interfere with it. And then blue gives us a preparation for a really drastic response. So let's imagine that red is constantly flying around and jamming stuff on orbit, all the altitudes. And blue says, forget it, we've had enough. We're going to field sky-darkening jammers of our own. We are going to jam absolutely everything. Only our photons will get through. Nobody else will be able to do anything. This is our sky now, everywhere. Okay, well, red can still concentrate locally and maybe output more jamming power and locally overwhelm. In fact, that's their goal. Create local failures in this huge, expensive blue array, whereas blue's goal would be something like make red never do this again. That actually is kind of challenging. On the strategic side, well, you'd want, this is a big ask for blue. They have to focus their attention on that, and they have to essentially achieve their no-lead goal, which is hard. On the counter-intel side, it is a wash on which side would have the edge, but I think the bigger question would be what capabilities would either side be willing to actually bring to the table? What would you commit? Even if you have things, you don't necessarily have to commit them at any point. And then on the logistics side, I think your questions would center around things like, well, how likely are you to actually lose hardware? Because if you lose a lot of hardware, you get a debris cascade on orbit, and you can't go to that orbit anymore. That's not great. That would be a critical failure if you have a lot of infrastructure invested in space already. So if we analogize further, the same advice to the big blue side would be play a long, expensive game. Oh, and that was pretty much the advice that one of the admirals on the Imperial side at Salamis actually gave to the emperor. Don't fight them all. Invest the Peloponnesus, surround them, let the allies disintegrate on their own. Make them spend money and waste time. So what does that look like in space? Well, if we could follow that advice, number one, I'd say don't fight. If you don't have a big combat between blue and red, you'll limit your logistics strain if you're blue, and you won't create enemy debris by smashing enemy red and essentially inadvertently disabling parts of the orbits that you might need later. Don't assemble either. Take your larger amount of vehicles. If you're blue, you have all this extra capability. Don't concentrate it all in one place, but spread it out into many elements. Pursue multiple objectives at the same time. And try really hard not to get plotzed yourself. That way you won't create friendly debris. And if the time comes, it might even be better to make a run for it rather than stand and fight. So try to make red waste propellant following you and time following you. Yeah, in fact, that would be the advice that I would give to blue, the equivalent of the Imperial side, to avoid a space Salamis. Make red chase you. Split into a lot of elements. Make them burn everywhere they have to go to follow you. Go to cislunar orbit. Go to the graveyard. Go to the edge of the atmosphere. Then come right back. Make them work for it. Play a long and expensive game. I think that's the best advice. And one thing I think that actually means, if blue has a space force, then the best Space Force Blue can get is actually a Space Force that is never going to do any fighting. I don't think I have any time for questions right now, but I will pop these references up here. If you are interested, that's where I would start doing some additional reading on the actual Battle of Salamis. And I think that's what I had to say. I'd be happy to turn it back over to Ian. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Phil. Great. Turning the Navy concept on its head in all the best ways, in my opinion.